Known for its sheer brutality, the Battle of Kohima is often called the Stalingrad of the East. This epic stand against the Japanese prevented a catastrophic invasion of India during World War II. In 1944, the Japanese 15th Army, led by Lieutenant General Renya Mutaguchi, launched Operation Yugo. Their objective was to capture the Imphal-Kohima region, opening the floodgates for a full-scale invasion of India. The Japanese succeeded in isolating Kohima and severing the vital road to Imphal, forcing the British Indian forces into a desperate and bloody defensive struggle. If the Japanese succeeded, they would sever Allied supply lines to China and shatter British control over India. Standing in the way of 15,000 Japanese troops was a battered and outnumbered British Indian garrison of about 2,500 men. These soldiers clung to their network of trenches, determined to hold the line at any cost. General William Slim, the leader of the Allied forces, faced an unimaginable challenge. He had to guide his men through some of the war's fiercest and most brutal close-quarter combat. As a relentless storm of Japanese artillery rained down on the beleaguered garrison, Slim and the Kent regiments prepared for the worst. They were on the brink of being overrun. As the assault began, the Japanese forces launched a massive thrust on Kohima, intending to crush the Allied defenders once and for all. The ensuing battle was violent, extraordinary, and outright strange, with the future of Southeast Asia being defined in a literal tennis match where grenades and bullets flew over the court instead of balls. War is hell, no matter where it's fought. However, there might not be a more horrifying place to wage war than Burma. One British officer called Burma, quote, "perfectly bloody, gorges, cliffs, mountains and dense forest, much of it spiny bamboo, whose spines, sharp as needles and hard as steel, are 3 to 10 inches long." The place seemed crafted to torment anyone who dared to cross its path. Standing 6 feet tall, razor-sharp kunai grass slashed at every step, while thorns and vines clawed at men's clothing, gear, and skin. Dense bamboo thickets demanded to be hacked through both at the base and beneath their snarled leaves, carving out a brutal tunnel for the advancing troops. Its unforgiving climate, dense jungles, and relentless monsoon rains turned the terrain into a muddy quagmire. The region was rife with diseases like malaria and dysentery, incapacitating many and adding strain to the already inadequate medical support. Logistical nightmares were common, as the lack of infrastructure meant supplies had to be arduously carried by porters or unreliably airdropped. Combat conditions were brutal, with guerrilla warfare and close-quarter fighting in the jungle's depths. As if that weren't enough, the place was plagued with insatiable giant mosquitoes, sandflies, and ticks. There were also leeches, which, if pulled off improperly, left the head behind, producing the Naga sore. This monstrous ulcer, 5 or 6 inches wide, ate into the flesh and muscle and could take the life of a man who did not receive medical attention. General William Slim, a seasoned officer and World War I veteran, called the border area, quote, "those hellish jungle mountains." He was no stranger to fighting in horrible conditions. Slim served in the Gallipoli campaign in Mesopotamia during World War I, earning a reputation for bravery and leadership. By World War II, Slim had earned a reputation for his strategic brilliance and knack for rallying troops in the toughest situations. Prior to Kohima, he led the 14th Army in Burma, where he faced significant logistical and tactical challenges against the Japanese. Slim's strategic approach emphasized flexibility, mobility, and the importance of morale. However, his most valuable leadership skill was adapting his men to endure the nightmarish conditions in Burma. In the early days of 1944, the jungles of Burma simmered with tension as both Allied and Japanese forces prepared for a decisive year of combat. General Slim, at the helm of the British 14th Army, was quietly laying plans for an offensive against the Japanese, unaware that his adversary was about to make the first move. Lieutenant General Renya Mutaguchi, commander of the Japanese 15th Army, faced a precarious situation. The vital railroad that served as his army's lifeline stretched vulnerably through Burma, constantly threatened by daring raids from British Chindit units. To the north, the lumbering advance of General Vinegar Joe Stilwell's Chinese forces added to the pressure. Mutaguchi knew that the Chindits would return in force once the monsoon season ended, potentially severing his supply lines for good. Weighing his options, Mutaguchi made a bold decision. Rather than wait for the Allied hammer to fall, he would strike first, disrupting British supply lines, and perhaps even thrust into India, where he hoped to ignite an uprising among Indian nationalists who opposed British rule. His plan relied heavily on the Indian National Army, or INA, a force of former British Indian Army soldiers who had switched allegiance to the Japanese. Formed in 1942, the INA was a force of former Indian prisoners of war who had agreed to fight alongside the Japanese against the British Empire. The INA's aim was to liberate India from British rule with Japanese assistance. However, this initial formation faced several organizational and leadership issues, leading to its disbandment later that year. In early 1944, as the dry season began, the Japanese initiated a two-pronged offensive aimed at disrupting British defenses in Burma. The first prong, codenamed Hargo, began in February in the Arakan region, targeting British positions to divert their attention from more strategic areas. This offensive met fierce resistance around the admin box position, defended by British units, including the 2nd West Yorkshire Regiment and the 6th Dragoons, along with various support personnel. Despite being an ad hoc defense force, they held their ground against a full Japanese division, inflicting approximately 5,000 casualties. The battle at the admin box was both a tactical and strategic victory for the British, demonstrating their resilience and ability to hold critical positions. Hargo achieved its objective of drawing British reserves, but at a high cost, and set the stage for a larger Japanese operation, codenamed Yugo, aimed at deeper penetration into British-held territory and a larger confrontation in eastern India. Yet with the INA dismantled, taking over India would not be a straightforward affair. Following the tactical setback of Hargo, the Japanese High Command turned its focus to the larger and more ambitious operation known as Yugo. This offensive aimed to penetrate deep into British-held Assam and capture the strategically vital areas of Dimapur and Imphal. These locations were crucial because they lay on the critical railroad line east of India's Brahmaputra River, a key supply route for the British 14th Army. The Japanese believed that capturing these areas could force the British to retreat from the border regions and potentially ignite a larger Indian uprising against British rule. Lieutenant General Renya Mutaguchi, the architect of Yugo, envisioned a grand triumph that would see Japanese forces overrun eastern India and secure a significant foothold on the subcontinent. Mutaguchi dreamed of riding a white horse triumphantly through the streets of Delhi, symbolizing Japanese dominance. However, the reality of the situation was far more complex and challenging than his ambitions suggested. The Japanese plan involved hurling 100,000 men at Assam, focusing on the key areas of Dimapur and Imphal. Their strategy hinged on the belief that if these areas could be overrun, the British forces would have no choice but to withdraw, leaving eastern India vulnerable to Japanese control. However, this grand prize required overcoming significant obstacles, including the well-fortified hill station at Kohima. Kohima, perched 5,000 feet above sea level on a saddle between two mountain ridges, commanded the only road between Imphal and Dimapur. The Japanese recognized that capturing Kohima was essential to severing British supply lines and securing their advance into Assam. As such, Mutaguchi committed the entire 31st Division to this critical objective, hoping to swiftly capture the position and pave the way for further advances. The British, however, were acutely aware of Kohima's strategic importance. They understood that holding this position was crucial to preventing a Japanese breakthrough. The British prepared to defend their vital supply lines at all costs. Faced with the imminent threat of the Japanese Yugo offensive, British General William Slim crafted a defensive strategy that would exploit the terrain and maximize the capabilities of his forces. Understanding the logistical challenges posed by the rugged landscape of Assam and Burma, Slim decided to make his stand on the Imphal plain rather than engaging the Japanese in the dense, mountainous jungles, where supply lines could easily be severed. General Slim's strategic decision was rooted in the necessity of maintaining a reliable supply chain. He knew that the British and Indian forces would be at a severe disadvantage if they had to fight on terrain that favored the Japanese. The Imphal Plain offered a more advantageous battlefield with its open spaces and better observation points. Here, Slim's forces could benefit from the support of the Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Forces, which could provide critical supplies and air support. One of the key components of Slim's strategy was the establishment of airstrips and large drop zones on the Imphal Plain. This allowed for continuous resupply operations, ensuring the British troops had the ammunition, food and medical supplies they needed to sustain prolonged engagements. The British and American transport aircraft flew in prodigious quantities of supplies, demonstrating a remarkable logistical feat. These airlift operations were vital, as the Japanese had effectively cut off the roadways north to the depots at Dimapur and west into India. General Slim's approach also emphasized the importance of maintaining strong defensive positions. By blocking the only road in the region leading west into India, Slim ensured that his forces could control the flow of the battle. The better observation and mobility on the plain allowed British fighter bombers and defensive firepower to dominate the battlefield. The RAF and USAF transport aircraft delivered over 14 million pounds of rations, 1 million gallons of fuel, and thousands of reinforcements while evacuating thousands of wounded soldiers. The onslaught began on March 8, 1944, with a large-scale Japanese assault on Imphal, the capital city of the Indian state of Manipur. The British forces held firm, bolstered by an extraordinary airlift of supplies. Despite the Japanese successfully severing the roads north to Dimapur and west into India, the airlift ensured that British troops at Imphal remained well supplied, a crucial factor in maintaining their defensive positions against relentless Japanese attacks. Meanwhile, the situation at neighboring Kohima was equally dire. Kohima quickly transformed into a critical battleground due to its strategic location commanding the road between Dimapur and Imphal. The Japanese, recognizing the importance of this position, launched relentless attacks against the small British garrison, which comprised various units, including the Royal West Kents, Indian troops, and local militia. The siege of Kohima saw some of the most intense and desperate fighting of the Burma campaign. The Japanese 31st Division, led by Lieutenant General Kotoku Sato, pressed hard against the defenders, aiming to capture the vital road and sever British supply lines. Despite being heavily outnumbered and facing constant shelling, the defenders of Kohima, supported by heroic efforts from the RAF and local Naga tribespeople, held their ground. The Nagas provided reliable intelligence and carried hundreds of wounded soldiers to safety through treacherous jungle terrain. The garrison of no more than 2,500 men was up against a Japanese force of more than 15,000 soldiers. The British had to rely on their trench system and defensive positions to hold the Japanese horde off. Night battles were a hallmark of the siege, with fierce hand-to-hand combat occurring at the Deputy Commissioner's bungalow, a site that became a centerpiece of the battle. Despite limited water and food, the garrison remained resolute, buoyed by acts of individual heroism and the support from artillery positioned at the brigade box in Jotsoma. The Japanese attacked relentlessly, often under the cover of darkness, with brutal close-quarters combat becoming the norm. The terrain was so twisted and chaotic that much of the fighting was settled by small units face-to-face with the enemy. Heroes emerged from this savage warfare. Lance Corporal John Harmon, a member of the West Kents, led his section with unmatched bravery. Single-handedly, he charged a Japanese machine gun position, obliterated the crew with a grenade, and hauled the captured gun back to his lines. But he didn't stop there. Advancing into a building housing enormous bread ovens, Harmon discovered the ovens were packed with Japanese soldiers. Racing back, he grabbed a box of grenades and systematically marched from one oven to the next. Pulling the pins and letting the safety levers fly for a few seconds, he hurled the grenades into each oven. Along the way, he captured 2 stunned prisoners, one of whom was an officer, and dragged them back to his lines, one under each arm. In the aftermath, 44 Japanese lost their lives in the bakery area, many falling to Harmon's relentless assault. But Harman's valor did not end there. The following day, he took on the Japanese alone, entrenching just 50 yards from his position. With covering fire from the section Bren gunner, Harman closed in on the enemy, taking 4 Japanese with his rifle and bayoneting a 5th. Standing tall and defiant, he returned to his position as his men yelled for him to run. Harman refused, whether out of sheer exhaustion or an unyielding refusal to flee from the enemy. Tragically, he was gunned down and mortally wounded before reaching safety. His comrades dragged him to their position and heard his final words, quote, "I got the lot. It was worth it." He passed within 5 minutes, earning the Victoria Cross posthumously, his country's highest award for bravery. At dusk on April 6th, the Japanese 58th Regiment unleashed a savage onslaught from the west, targeting the hill features known as DES and FSD. Waves of soldiers surged forward, leaving piles of corpses behind, yet managed to reach the bashas or supply huts. The West Kent counterattacked with ruthless efficiency, led by sappers wielding pole-mounted demolition charges. Men battled through infernos as the bashas burned, driving the Japanese back into a scene of utter carnage. Amid the chaos, the Deputy Commissioner's bungalow in Kohima descended into mayhem, its tennis court transforming into a hellish battleground. The British clung to one side, the Japanese the other, with grenades bouncing and exploding across the court each night. A British officer's makeshift V-shaped wooden barrier deflected Japanese grenades in the darkness, and the British found grim satisfaction in the whoomp of grenades detonating in Japanese positions. The waves of Japanese soldiers seemed endless. With each step, the Japanese 31st Division inched closer to the heart of Kohima. The defenders, parched and rationed to half a mug of water per day, fought with desperate tenacity. Aerial resupplies brought crucial ammunition, rations and water, but much fell beyond the garrison's reach. Despite exhaustion, the combat remained ferocious. The British, vastly outnumbered, fought with calculated cunning, while the Japanese leveraged their numbers for massive charges into British trenches. As the enemy surged forward, screaming and blowing bugles, British troops held their fire until the attackers were a mere 15 yards away, then mowed them down with rifle, machine gun and Bren gun fire. Any Japanese who breached the British lines were met with bayonets or whatever heavy objects were at hand. One soldier played dead throughout the day, then bolted across the tennis court to safety at nightfall. A West Kent Bren gunner, regaining consciousness, found a Japanese officer in his trench and took him out with his bare hands before resuming the fight. Another soldier shot 3 Japanese in rapid succession as they leaped into his trench. Lieutenant Colonel John Young, the senior doctor, braved enemy lines to organize care for the wounded. Leading a team of stretcher bearers, he retrieved 200 blankets from trucks outside the lines. Young and other doctors worked tirelessly, yet the situation remained dire. By the siege's end, 600 seriously wounded men lay in trenches, clutching a single round in their magazines to avoid capture by the Japanese. British troops manned crucial outposts to halt the relentless Japanese advance into India. Holding on to Kohima turned the tide against the Japanese offensive and cemented the legendary status of the heroic British stand. Despite the grim circumstances, moments of remarkable courage and resourcefulness helped maintain morale. On Easter Sunday, the colour sergeant in charge of rations braved heavy fire to deliver a surprisingly lavish meal to the troops. Even to soldiers mere yards from enemy lines, he managed to provide stew, potatoes, tea and sardines, apologising only for the absence of traditional pink eggs. The siege intensified as April wore on. By the 14th, reinforcements from the Dorset Regiment and Cameron Highlanders had linked up with the brigade at nearby Jotsoma. However, on April 17th, exhausted troops from the Assam Regiment and Assam Rifles lost a critical position at Kuki PK to a Japanese breakthrough. It seemed Japan could still overwhelm the area. In the face of this setback, the West Kents held firm even when completely isolated and depleted. They drew inspiration from men like Sergeant Major Haynes. Even after being blinded by a wound, Haynes continued to rally his troops until the very end, when he was shot. The Japanese assault ultimately faltered under relentless fire, the Banzai charges breaking before the West Kents like water upon rocks. Accurate mortar rounds executed by the reinforcing forces finally put an end to the Japanese offensive. The garrison's ordeal neared its end on April 18th. After such an extended campaign, the Japanese spearheads could not hold any longer. British artillery began pounding Japanese positions, followed by airstrikes from Hurricane fighter bombers. A relief force, including the 1st Punjabis and tank regiments, finally broke through. As trucks and ambulances arrived, the road to Kohima was reopened, and the beleaguered defenders were at last relieved. The British counter-offensive continued into the surrounding hills, but nature soon added to the challenges. May brought the monsoon, drenching the troops and turning the battlefield into a muddy quagmire. Nonetheless, the British pressed on, methodically driving General Sato's forces from their positions. Recognizing defeat, Sato ordered a retreat, leaving behind rear guards to slow the British advance. The entire campaign, from the siege of Kohima to the expulsion of Japanese forces from the area, lasted 64 grueling days. British and Indian forces suffered 4,000 casualties, while Japanese losses were estimated at twice that number. The victory at Kohima, coupled with the simultaneous success at Imphal, marked a turning point in the Burma campaign. This triumph for British and Indian forces signaled the beginning of the end for Japanese ambitions in the region, paving the way for the Allied reconquest of Burma. December 7th, 1941, was a seemingly ordinary Sunday within the hallowed chambers of the White House residence. After attending the only meeting of the day with the Chinese ambassador, President Franklin D. Roosevelt made some time for recreation, working on his beloved stamp collection, accompanied by his trusted aide, Harry Hopkins. Suddenly, the phone on the president's desk blasted with a shrill and cold ring. Navy Secretary Frank Knox's voice trembled through the line, his words carrying the weight of an unspeakable disaster. Japanese aircraft were attacking Pearl Harbor. "No!" Roosevelt reportedly roared, alarmed as Hopkins jumped to his feet, startled by the unexpected situation. The president's advisor tried to reassure the leader by saying that it must have been a mistake. Japan would never attack the US. But the seasoned head of state knew better. He said this was just the kind of unexpected move the Japanese would make. FDR was scared, angry, and bewildered. Still, he managed to channel all his emotions into pure resolve. America would make Japan rue the day they attacked the US. The United States government decided it would exact a specific and singular retribution upon the mastermind who orchestrated the devastating strike. Thus began a tense, years-long pursuit to trace the footprints of the enigmatic Japanese Marshal Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto as he moved across the Pacific Theater. As the US closed in on him, Yamamoto seemed to suspect the gravity of his actions and the consequences they could bring. He would famously say, quote, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." In April of 1943, the codebreakers of the enigmatic Magic intelligence program finally pierced through a series of secure Japanese broadcasts, intercepting the itinerary of the cunning Yamamoto. With their target in sight, the US intelligence apparatus launched Operation Vengeance with the help of Japanese-American allies. It is said that FDR himself issued the iconic command, "Get Yamamoto." At the sound of his orders, a squadron of P-38 Lightnings took to the skies, ready to hunt down the man who had dared stir the wrath of the mighty United States of America. Before FDR received the fateful call that would change the course of history, the relationship between the US and Japan had been deteriorating steadily for almost 3 years. In spite of the rising tensions, the two nations were in constant diplomatic talks and negotiations in a bid to improve the link between both countries. Japan's insatiable imperialistic expansionism in East Asia and the Pacific had turned the US from an ally into a disgruntled neutral player and a critic of the Japanese regime. Frustrated by its confined territories and lack of strategic resources, and convinced that it had been chosen by fate to become the superpower of Asia, Japan launched a series of ambitious campaigns to take over massive swathes from China and the islands of the Pacific. When Japan unleashed the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937, the US and its Western allies were gravely concerned by its actions and the brutality of its attacks. The US and other Western powers imposed economic sanctions on Japan in response to its aggression in China. These sanctions included embargoes on strategic materials such as oil, steel, and scrap metal, vital for Japan's war efforts and industrial growth. The US also froze Japanese assets in response to Japan's occupation of French Indochina in 1940. Even so, the sanctions found Japan undeterred, and the Japanese continued to wage war across the region. The entire situation dramatically climaxed in August 1941, when the US wholly embargoed oil exports to Japan. The abrupt cutoff of the US supply, accounting for around 80% of Japan's oil, dealt an enormous setback to Japan's war apparatus. Acknowledging the severity of the predicament, Japan was left with only a choice of extremes. It could either halt its territorial expansion at once, or it could go further than ever in antagonizing America. Having gone so far already, the Japanese settled on a strategy centered on incapacitating the US Navy's Pacific Fleet. This move was intended to hamper any potential intervention from the US as Japan sought to capture the mineral-rich Southeast Asian territories, notably the Dutch East Indies. If the empire played its cards right, the US would not only be unable to interfere in the region, but it might just push them to negotiate a settlement on terms more favorable to Japan. Soon the US might be willing to resume oil exports, and Japan would continue to cement its hold on Asia. With little resources to spare and a constrained military industry, Japan needed a short, decisive war with the US, a conflict that would last only a few weeks if possible. The proud empire considered democracies inherently weak and prone to avoiding conflict, and they were sure the isolationist nation would try to prevent a large-scale conflict over such a vast region as the Pacific if it threatened to prolong. As the Japanese High Command discussed such matters, FDR disregarded Japan as a significant threat to America, considering that if the US was to ever enter World War II, it would be to face Nazi Germany. After all, even when not mobilized, the US had three things Japan lacked: an almost unending supply of strategic resources and a massive population that could be turned into a formidable fighting force, and a powerful modern fleet stationed right there in the Pacific. Japan would be insane to attack. Isoroku Yamamoto would carve his name in history as one of the most brilliant leaders of the Japanese Empire. His exceptional mind schemed the infamous assault on Pearl Harbor, a calculated preemptive strike against a neutral nation. Throughout his prestigious career, Yamamoto held numerous positions within the Imperial Japanese Navy and became the driving force behind the nation's naval aviation program. As the commander-in-chief at the outset of the Pacific War, he masterminded several pivotal battles of World War II. Intriguingly, Yamamoto possessed a profound understanding of the United States, having studied at Harvard and gained an intimate familiarity with American life and military might. Wielding exceptionally fluent English, the man studied American customs and business practices for many years. When he was appointed a naval attaché in Washington, D.C., he gained a deep understanding of U.S. Navy doctrines and the state-of-the-art naval technology used by the United States. This, as well as his studying of British naval doctrine, would later drive him to push for similar advancement within the Japanese Navy and turn him into a fervent advocate of the might of naval aviation. This keen awareness of American prowess likely influenced his reluctance to engage in military conflict with the United States and the broader Allied powers when some officials toyed with the idea. Knowing firsthand the raw capabilities of American industry, Yamamoto warned, quote, "In the first 6 to 12 months of a war with the United States and Great Britain, I will run wild and win victory upon victory. But then, if the war continues after that, I have no expectation of success." Despite his reservations about Japan's prospects in the long run, Yamamoto's unwavering loyalty to his country drove him to serve with honor and distinction. His exceptional contributions earned him the admiration and adoration of the Japanese people. Still, as Yamamoto's ominous prediction became true and the war dragged on, Japanese naval forces began to show significant signs of weakness. In 1943, as the tide began to turn against Japan with the American capture of Guadalcanal, a beleaguered Yamamoto embarked on a tour of naval air units to assess the mounting damage. The once unstoppable strategist now faced the grim reality of a conflict spiraling beyond his control. Following secretive procedures and utterly confident in the indecipherability of their codes, Japanese radio operators in the Pacific broadcast a series of high-priority messages on April 13, 1943. The information, sent to their commands in Guadalcanal, meticulously detailed Admiral Yamamoto's upcoming itinerary in the region. Unbeknownst to the Japanese, however, the American Military Intelligence Service, or MIS, had secretly been intercepting Japanese communications for several years. This intelligence operation was powered by an unusual group, the Nisei. These second-generation Japanese Americans proved instrumental in deciphering the sophisticated JN25D code used by the Japanese, even with its combination of distinct cultural nuances to mask certain terms. The Nisei, working within the MIS, dedicated themselves to extracting valuable intelligence from documents and captured personnel, all part of a concerted effort against Japan. Enhancing the reliability of their translations, linguists stationed in Alaska and Hawaii also evaluated intercepted messages. Together, they could reach a consensus in just minutes, drawing from their profound understanding of both the language and culture. Among these diligent Nisei was Harold Fudena, an MIS soldier who earned recognition for intercepting the particularly critical radio message on a day that would prove pivotal in the unfolding conflict. From the deciphered intelligence, the MIS deduced that Admiral Yamamoto would embark on a direct route from Rabaul to the Balalai airfield, traversing a distance of 315 miles. This information allowed the Americans to estimate his whereabouts during each minute of the flight with astonishing precision. For the attack to unfold seamlessly, they would need the Japanese pilots to act predictably, with no delays or changes to the itinerary. It was a gamble, but one worth taking. Admiral Chester Nimitz, the US commander in the Pacific, greenlit an audacious operation proposed by 339th Squadron Commander Major John W. Mitchell. Mitchell calculated that the influential Japanese admiral could be intercepted just before landing at Balalai at precisely 9:35 a.m. With its target on the board, Operation Vengeance hinged on a vital consideration: selecting the perfect aircraft for the task. Certain fighter aircraft, such as the F-4F Wildcat, powerful as they were, lacked the range to reach the aircraft soaring over Bougainville, situated 400 miles from the American airbase in Guadalcanal. As if the distance wasn't daunting enough to evade detection, pilots would need to maintain a discrete distance of at least 50 miles from the shore, navigating a dead-reckoning course at an altitude of 50 feet or less and flying in a roundabout trajectory that would increase the travel distance to more than 600 miles. The Lockheed P-38G Lightning, a marvel of the US Air Force, emerged as the sole aircraft possessing the mandatory range and capabilities for the mission. Nevertheless, the warplanes were not perfect. They were deprived of radar, rendering them reliant on the pilot's wits and ingenuity to locate the target. Adding external guidance support would risk drawing the attention of the Japanese forces in the region. Undeterred by the obstacles, Mitchell personally requested the installation of the Navy compass on his Lightning to achieve the necessary navigational precision, setting the stage for an unparalleled feat in aerial fighting history. Unconfirmed reports suggest that the master plan of Operation Vengeance was relayed directly to President Franklin D. Roosevelt. The Commander-in-Chief had been patiently biding his time for nearly 2 years, awaiting the opportune moment to strike. With the simple yet resolute command of Get Yamamoto, FDR unleashed the full fury of American power upon the mastermind behind the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor, setting the stage for a dramatic and implacable showdown. On the dawn of April 18, 1943, renowned ace pilot John W. Mitchell fearlessly spearheaded the daring mission. The 18 selected P-38 Lightnings, poised to target the Admiral, were armed with their standard 20mm cannon and 4 machine guns. Additional drop tanks were fitted onto each aircraft to accommodate the extensive journey. For the crucial mission, 18 planes were hand-picked, with 4 designated to assault Yamamoto's aircraft, while the rest ascended to form a protective shield against the Japanese escorting fighters. The pilots were briefed only partially, informed that their target was a high-ranking Japanese officer sighted by a coast watcher, but never allowed to know that they were hunting down Yamamoto himself. However, the official account has been somewhat contested by a witness who claimed that Mitchell disclosed Yamamoto's identity at the last minute, before the squadron took off to galvanize the pilots. The resolute Mitchell ultimately discarded the initial flight plan, meticulously crafted by Command Operations Officer Marine Major John Condon. Believing the airspeeds and time estimates to be unsuitable for intercepting Yamamoto, Mitchell sought an alternative. With the support of several of his pilots, he recalculated an intercept time of 9:35 a.m., predicated on the Admiral's itinerary. The revised plan aimed to catch the bombers as they descended over Bougainville, a mere 10 minutes before touching down at Balalai. This bold strategy would prove pivotal in the unfolding drama of Operation Vengeance. Issues began to hinder the operation before it began, however, and only 16 of the intended 18 planes lifted off from the airfield as 2 pilots assigned to the kill squad encountered mechanical flaws on their warplanes, one with a flat tire and the other with a faulty fuel feed. The 2 pilots from the kill squad who successfully embarked on the mission were Captain Thomas G. Lanphier and Lieutenant Rex T. Barber. Silently, they traveled 600 miles at a low altitude, and their chances of success seemed slim. This audacious pursuit would become the fighter intercept mission, requiring the longest distance flight of the entire war. On the other side of the scheme, in Rabaul, a tired, strained Yamamoto remained steadfast in his decision to proceed with the journey, despite the apprehensions of local Japanese commanders who implored him to cancel the trip, due to the looming threat of an ambush. Consumed by the growing defeats of Japanese forces in the Pacific, the Admiral desperately tried to personally assess the damage of previous losses. He planned to conduct an inspection tour of the Solomon Islands and New Guinea. With few victories for Japan lately, the battle-hardened officer wanted to scrutinize the Japanese air units for Operation Ego, which had commenced on April 7, 1943, and to bolster the morale of Japanese forces in the wake of the calamitous Guadalcanal campaign and the subsequent evacuation that unfolded during January and February. Yamamoto's presence was intended to serve as a beacon of hope and a symbol of unwavering determination for his troops in these challenging times. Despite the risks, Yamamoto's Mitsubishi G4M1 Betty bomber transport, along with one other, took off as scheduled for the expedition. The Japanese planes ascended to an altitude of 6,500 feet, where an escort of Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters vigilantly positioned themselves at their 4 o'clock, 1,500 feet higher. The guards split into 2 V formations, each comprising 3 planes. They forged ahead into the perilous skies, unaware of the American ambush lying in wait. Mitchell's squadron flew low, with the attack warplanes leading the pack, now comprising Lanphier, Barber and backups, Besby F. Holmes and Raymond K. Hine, trailing close behind. Battling drowsiness after the hours-long trip, Mitchell navigated by flight plan and Navy compass. The American Lightnings arrived at the intercept point exactly 1 minute early at 9:34, just in time to witness Yamamoto's aircraft descending into view amidst the hazy clouds. The P-38s jettisoned their auxiliary fuel tanks, turned right to parallel the bombers, and commenced a full-power climb to intercept Yamamoto. At the most crucial moment, Holmes's P-38 failed to detach its tanks, and his 2-man element retreated toward the sea. Mitchell ordered Lanphier and Barber to engage, and they ascended toward the 8 aircraft. The nearest Japanese escort fighters also dropped their tanks and dove at the pair of P-38s. Lanphier immediately confronted and climbed toward the Japanese fighters, while Barber pursued the diving Japanese bomber transports. Banking steeply to align with the bombers, Barber momentarily lost sight of them. Upon re-establishing contact, he found himself directly behind one and unleashed a barrage of fire into its right engine, rear fuselage and empennage. Hitting its left engine, the bomber spewed heavy black smoke, rolled violently to the left, and narrowly avoided colliding with Barber. Glancing back, he saw a pillar of dark smoke and inferred the targeted Betty had crashed into the jungle below. Barber then skirted the treetops, scouring the area for the second bomber transport, unaware of which one concealed the high-ranking officer. Spotting the second Betty carrying Chief of Staff Vice Admiral Matomi Ugaki, as well as part of Yamamoto's staff, Barber observed it flying low over the water, attempting to evade Holmes's attack. Holmes had damaged the Betty's right engine, which emitted a white vapor trail. As Holmes and Hine overshot the damaged bomber, Barber launched his assault, causing the crippled aircraft to violently shed metal debris, which in turn damaged his own plane. The bomber lost altitude and crash-landed in the water. Ugaki and 2 others survived and were later rescued. As the American pilots continued to focus on the bombers, Barber, Holmes and Hine faced an onslaught of Zeros, with Barber's P-38 sustaining 104 hits and Hine's warplane being seriously damaged amid the bullet storm. During the skirmish, Holmes and Barber each claimed to have shot down a Zero, although Japanese records indicate no Zeros were lost. The top cover warplanes briefly engaged the Zeros without scoring any kills. Meanwhile, Mitchell observed the smoke from Yamamoto's downed bomber. By then, Hine's P-38 had vanished, presumably crashing into the water. With fuel running dangerously low, the P-38s disengaged, and Holmes was forced to land in the Russell Islands due to his critically low fuel levels. Hine was the sole American pilot who did not return. Chaotic, blistering and intense, the clash had rendered successful results for the bold American pilots, who had just managed to take down one of the most infamous leaders of the Imperial Japanese Navy. On April 19th, a day after the attack, a Japanese search and rescue party discovered Yamamoto's crash site and body in the jungle north of Buin, a former Australian patrol post and Catholic mission. Yamamoto had been thrown clear of the wreckage, with his white-gloved hand grasping his katana's hilt, his body still positioned upright in his seat under a tree. The retrieval party noted that Yamamoto was instantly recognizable, his head tilted as if deep in thought. A post-mortem revealed 2 bullet wounds, one to the back of his left shoulder and another to his lower jaw. Japanese media considerably altered the factors behind the admiral's demise. The public was officially informed about the incident on May 21, 1943. The announcement claimed that Yamamoto had perished in April while leading his men on the front lines, engaging in combat with the enemy and meeting a gallant demise on a warplane. For the US military, the event led to a huge morale boost, as it not only depicted the formidable intelligence and operational capabilities and highlighted the growing weaknesses of the Japanese military and its command structure. The American public learned of Yamamoto's end through the May 21st Japanese statement. With no official report from US authorities, the American press ran wild, speculating that the Japanese announcement was a cover for Yamamoto having committed seppuku due to Japan's war not going well. The whole story of the operation, including that it was based on broken codes, was not revealed to the American public until September 10, 1945, after the war had ended. British intelligence officials were livid by the operation. They did not share the same visceral feelings toward Yamamoto as the Americans. They did not believe that killing an admiral, even one as influential as Yamamoto, was worth the risk of losing Allied code-breaking abilities against Japan. Prime Minister Winston Churchill personally protested the decision to go ahead with the operation to President Roosevelt. The high-profile mission would also become a source of controversy for those Americans inside the military, as soon heated debate over which US pilot shot down the admiral's aircraft arose. Captain Thomas Lanphier was initially credited with the kill. Even as he landed on Henderson's Field, he famously radioed Guadalcanal fighter director stating, quote, "That son of a bitch will not be dictating any peace terms in the White House." This bold statement breached security protocols and put the code-breaking program at risk. Upon touchdown, Lanphier's aircraft experienced an engine failure due to fuel starvation. Despite the forced landing, he immediately put in an official claim for shooting down Admiral Yamamoto. As the days passed, skepticism arose as other pilots on the mission questioned the official account. Japanese military records and testimony from surviving escort pilot Kenji Yanagiya further contradicted Lanphier's claims, fueling the dispute. Rex Barber, another pilot involved in the operation, contested Lanphier's version of events, leading to a prolonged battle over the rightful claim to the kill that persisted even after both men passed away. Barber petitioned the Air Force Board for the correction of military records to change his shared credit with Lanphier to full credit, but the board's decision remained split. The US Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals refused to intervene in the matter. Despite the uncertainty and conflicting accounts, the mission remains an extraordinary event in military history. In 1993, then Secretary of the Air Force Donald Rice commented on the enduring speculation surrounding the events of that day in 1943, stating, "There is glory for the whole team." The unresolved controversy surrounding Operation Vengeance highlights the complex and often contentious nature of determining credit in high-stakes military operations, and it would lead to more meticulous debriefing procedures after missions within the US military.
Under a dark August sky in 1942, the sea roared wildly as rubber boats pitched and struggled against relentless waves after a brutal raid had spiraled far from the plan. The distant drone of Japanese seaplanes grew louder as the battered survivors of the 2nd Marine Raider Battalion fought desperately to escape Makin Island. If the aircraft spotted the American submarines waiting offshore, the raiders' slim hopes would evaporate. Aboard USS Argonaut and USS Nautilus, crews worked feverishly, hauling drenched and weary Marines aboard as the first Japanese planes swept over the horizon. In a final frantic push, the last boatload of raiders was pulled from the churning surf. Not a moment too soon, the submarines submerged, out of sight. But something was wrong. As the raiders began to share their accounts of events, a grim realization dawned on them. 9 men were missing. The Marine Raiders tasked with raiding Makin Island were a special American covert unit designed to take the fight to the enemy in the most unconventional way possible. Inspired by the British commandos, these elite units were created to strike swiftly and decisively, targeting lightly defended Japanese-held islands scattered across the vast Pacific. Their formation was a response to Admiral Chester Nimitz's urgent call for forces capable of amphibious raids. From their inception in February 1942, the 1st and 2nd Raider Battalions were designed to be anything but typical. Specializing in small boat insertions, light infantry warfare, and daring operations behind enemy lines, they embraced innovation and risk. The man behind this concept was Major Evans Carlson, a man whose unorthodox ideas had reached all the way up to President Roosevelt. Carlson had fought in the trenches of France during World War I, earned the Navy Cross in Nicaragua, and witnessed firsthand the brutal tactics of the Imperial Japanese Army while serving as an intelligence officer in China. There, he absorbed the guerrilla warfare tactics of Chinese Communist forces and returned to America determined to prepare his nation for the incoming storm. He knew Japan was a threat, one that could not just be fought conventionally. Carlson's ideas often clashed with traditional military doctrine. His left-leaning politics and affinity for the Chinese communists made him a controversial figure, but his direct relationship with FDR gave him leverage to push boundaries. His raiders were less hierarchical, more focused on cohesion and what he called ethical indoctrination, ensuring every man knew why they fought and held those values dear. The command was based on merit and not rank. He reorganized the Marine squad structure into 10-man units centered on firepower, equipping his men with Browning automatic rifles, Thompson submachine guns, and M1 rifles. The spirit of his unit was encapsulated in the term gung-ho, a Chinese phrase meaning working together, which Carlson had adopted and infused with a sense of enthusiasm and purpose. This philosophy would face its ultimate test in the summer of 1942. While Edson's first raiders gained fame during the legendary defense of Edson's Ridge, Carlson's second raiders prepared for a bold strike, the raid on Makin Island. A speck of land in the Gilbert Chain, Makin Island seemed tailor-made for the raiders' daring strike. It was precisely what Nimitz had envisioned when calling for raids on lightly defended Japanese outposts. Occupied in December 1941, Makin was a Japanese seaplane base housing several reconnaissance aircraft that monitored all around the Gilbert Islands. Its garrison was a modest force of roughly 70 troops tasked with maintaining the planes and defending the atoll. While other potential targets, such as the Aleutian island of Attu, had been considered, they were deemed too heavily fortified and too far afield to serve the operation's purpose, drawing Japanese reinforcements away from Guadalcanal, where the more extensive campaign was unfolding. The raiders of the 2nd Marine Battalion, totaling 211 men, boarded 2 submarines, USS Argonaut and USS Nautilus, for their mission. Their orders were to land via rubber boats, destroy the Japanese seaplane base, eliminate the garrison, gather intelligence, and cause as much disruption as possible to draw the attention of all nearby Japanese troops. It was a bold plan, but fraught with challenges, not least of which was the inexperience of the Marines themselves. Carlson later admitted that few raiders had ever set foot on a submarine before, let alone trained for operations involving them. The raid was timed for August 17th, just 10 days after the initial Guadalcanal invasion. The objective was to make the Japanese believe that Makin was the prelude to more significant American offensives in the Gilberts. However, from the outset, things began to go south. The landing plan centered on LCRLs, large rubber rafts designed to carry 10 men and powered by small outboard motors. The original intent was for the raiders to embark on these rafts while the submarines submerged beneath them, creating a seamless launch. But on the morning of August 16th, after 9 days of cramped travel from Pearl Harbor, the raiders emerged to wild seas that churned with relentless swells. Worse still, a ceaseless driving rain, turning what was supposed to be a precise operation into a chaotic nightmare. Loading the boats became almost impossible. Equipment and supplies were swept away by the rising waves. The submarines were forced to abandon their planned procedure, lowering the rafts over the side into the tumultuous surf instead. The outboard motors proved no match for the conditions. Many became swamped, leaving the Marines to rely on paddles. In the darkness, drenched and disoriented, the raiders struggled to coordinate as they rowed their flimsy boats towards unmeasurable dangers. Carlson said it was a confused mess, with boats tumbling across the surf as the raiders struggled to stay afloat. The raiders stumbled ashore on Makin Island in disarray, their equipment battered and scattered by the waves. The darkness was impenetrable. In Carlson's words, as dark as the inside of a black cow. Tensions were high after such a chaotic landing, but the frustration reached a fever point when a Marine accidentally discharged his weapon, risking the entire operation in a split second. Boats were missing, including one carrying Lieutenant Oscar Petros, the commander of Company B. In the chaos, Petros and his men, unaware of a last-minute change, landed at a secondary beach only to find themselves completely isolated. Meanwhile, the rest of the raiders landed at Beach Z, hiding their rafts under palm fronds and bracing for action. As dawn broke, Carlson rallied his scattered force, radioing the Nautilus with the grim assessment that the landing had been lousy. Despite the confusion, the raiders pressed inland, guided by friendly island natives who revealed the location of the Japanese garrison. Almost immediately, they encountered sniper fire. The raiders moved as fast as they could to neutralize the sniper threat before it took its toll. Sergeant Clyde Thomason, towering at 6'4", a height that required a special waiver to join the raiders, ran up to a house concealing a sniper, breached the door open, and gunned down the enemy in a burst of gunfire just as he was fixing his aim on a fellow raider. The raiders spotted a Japanese truck carrying reinforcements. Dean Winters of Company A fired a boy's anti-tank rifle, the so-called elephant gun, striking the truck and sending Japanese soldiers spilling out. Then the engine exploded violently. Thomason quickly organized his men into a defensive horseshoe formation, anticipating the inevitable counterattack. When the Japanese charged with fixed bayonets in a ferocious banzai charge, the raiders held their ground, cutting down the attackers with disciplined, controlled fire. For Sergeant Thomason, the only response to a chaotic banzai charge was a calculated and calm response that negated the psychological impact of the Japanese tactic. But after halting the charge, the advancing raiders stumbled into another enemy trap. Machine guns opened up from hidden positions, pinning the raiders down. Carlson's men flanked and neutralized the threat, but not without cost. Thomason, a linchpin of the unit's morale, was taken down by a sniper as he exposed himself to draw enemy fire away from his men. The battle devolved into a brutal sniper engagement, later named the Battle of the Breadfruit Trees. Japanese marksmen targeted squad leaders, radio operators, and even medics, forcing them to remove Red Cross armbands. The situation was further complicated when Japanese seaplanes arrived, strafing the raiders and forcing the American submarines to dive for safety. The raiders retaliated with machine guns and anti-tank rifles, shooting down two planes, a Nakajima E-8N Dave and a massive Kawanishi H-8K Emily. The destruction of the aircraft was a rare success amid growing uncertainty. After such a harrowing start, and unaware the Japanese garrison was nearly annihilated, Carlson faced mounting pressure. With high surf making a return to the submarines treacherous and the risk of Japanese reinforcements looming, he made the difficult decision to attempt withdrawal under cover of darkness. If he had pushed just a little farther, his force would have quickly captured the Japanese base and its airfield, as just a handful of enemy soldiers were manning the defenses. Despite their losses and exhaustion, the raiders had wreaked havoc on the island. They located and burned over 1,000 barrels of Japanese aviation fuel, ensuring that the island's utility to the enemy would be severely diminished. As the raiders rushed back towards the submarines, only a fraction of the force made it through the pounding waves to the vessels. Unable to raise the Nautilus or Argonaut on the radio, Carlson and over 120 stranded raiders spent a harrowing night, hungry, wet, and exhausted. By morning, communication was re-established with the Argonaut. Lieutenant Petros and Major Roosevelt orchestrated a daring plan to evacuate the remaining raiders, knowing the Japanese could send reinforcements that very day. As evening fell, using their lashed-together rafts and two native outrigger canoes, the wounded and weary raiders paddled back to the submarines under the cover of darkness. With Japanese planes patrolling the skies, the submarines couldn't risk remaining in the open during daylight. As the 120 men made it into the vessels, the submarines immediately dove, and just a Japanese patrol boat plane made it to the area. Carlson was sure that all of the 30 Marines who were missing had fallen on the island. Yet, as the submarines left the atoll and the men shared their accounts of events, the grim realization that they had left 9 men stranded on the island emerged. Carlson tried to have the submarines turned around, but the risks were too great. For years, the fate of the 9 Marines remained a mystery until intercepted Japanese communications unveiled their harrowing story. Stranded deep in hostile territory and realizing there was no rescue coming, the group fractured. 4 of the raiders chose to surrender. They made their way to the coast, where they signaled their intentions to a Japanese patrol plane in the distance. But the remaining 5 were determined to defy the odds. They hatched a daring plan. Under the cloak of night, they seized a small trading yacht, the Kariyama Kingo, property of the South Seas Trading Company. The wharf fell silent behind them as they set out, their only chance lying in the treacherous waters ahead. They navigated the yacht toward what they believed to be a narrow escape route on the western side of the atoll. Suddenly, the hull scraped against the unseen labyrinth of reefs and hidden sandbanks, lodging the vessel in place and completely ruining their escape plans. Stranded once more, they abandoned the yacht, plunging into the sea. Swimming and wading through hostile waters, they clawed their way to the shore. Dawn broke, revealing their location. Japanese soldiers swept in and captured them before they could hide again. Japanese reports reveal the American POWs were taken to Kwajalein Atoll, where they were imprisoned and interrogated for 6 weeks. The local commander wanted to send them to the mainland of Japan, as Kwajalein was on the fringes of Japanese territory and could be lost at any moment. When his request was denied, he ordered their execution by master swordsmen near the western shore of the atoll. The raiders were buried, and flowers were offered as part of Japanese tradition. The debate over whether the Makin Island raid was a success or failure continues to this day. Tactically, the raiders had annihilated the Japanese garrison, sunk 2 vessels, destroyed 2 seaplanes, and eliminated over 1,000 barrels of critical aviation fuel. Although they failed to capture prisoners, they did seize valuable intelligence about Japanese defenses in the Gilbert Islands. Strategically, however, the raid didn't achieve its primary objective of diverting reinforcements from Guadalcanal. Still, the raid was a powerful propaganda victory at a time when the nation desperately needed good news. Dr. Stephen Stigler, the raiders' surgeon, recalled the emotional reception they received upon their return to Pearl Harbor. By the time we got abreast of the first ship, they were standing at attention saluting us. Each ship we passed saluted us. They were playing the Marine Corps hymn and they were cheering. It was all very emotional. However, the cost of the mission was sobering, especially when the story of the remaining 9 raiders came to light. In 1947, Japanese Admiral Koso Abe was convicted of war crimes and paid with his life for these executions. For their bravery, Carlson was awarded his 2nd Navy Cross, and Major Roosevelt and Lieutenant Pete Ross received the same honor. Sergeant Clyde Thomason was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, becoming the first Marine of World War II to receive it.